A health psychologist by training, Dr. Margaret Hay has worked in health professional education for the past 2 decades in both curriculum governance and teaching roles. She is the inaugural head of the Monash Centre for Professional Development and Monash Online Education in the portfolio of the Deputy Vice-Chancellor at Monash University. Prior to this, she was inaugural director of the Professional and Continuing Education and the inaugural director of the Monash Institute for Health and Clinical Education in the Faculty of Medicine, Nursing, and Health Sciences. She has supervised to completion 19 doctoral research projects and has been thrice nominated for Supervisor Awards and is currently supervising a range of Ph.D. and master's projects in health professions education, having transitioned from her research in health psychology. She is Australian and spent some time studying in the U.S., so we compared the medical education systems of both countries. And we discussed the strengths and weaknesses. We also discussed what the admissions process is really designed to select for, why diversity of educational backgrounds leads to better outcomes, why medical education should follow students' leads rather than vice versa, and how to teach without making the learner feel like garbage, which we all felt at some point. Dr. Hay is a co-opted member of the Australian and New Zealand Intensive Care Society Educational Committee and has taught several Harvard Macy Institute courses in Boston and Harvard Partners International courses for the National Health Group, Singapore. She is a member of the Course Steering Committee for the Harvard Medical School Master's in Medical Education degree.
Welcome to the Physician's Guide to Doctoring, a practical guide for practicing physicians. Dr. Bradley Block interviews experts in and out of medicine to find out everything we should have been learning while we were memorizing Krebs cycle. The ideas expressed on this podcast are those of the interviewer and interviewee and do not represent those of their respective employers. And now, here's Dr. Bradley Block.
Dr. Margaret Hay, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Brad. I really appreciate it.
So what is your origin story? How did you end up getting into medical education?
Yes, well, thank you for asking me that. To be honest, it was a good opportunity to reflect on this and my journey because it wasn't anything I planned to do. I was appointed as a level B lecturer more than 20 years ago at Monash, and I was teaching in psychology. And at that point, all academics had to do a graduate certificate, so a graduate degree in education. Because in Australia, at least, university academics don't have to have any formal training or didn't have to have any formal training. So there were 2 options. One was a higher education sort of standard course, and another was a course specifically for education in the health professions. And of course, being a psychologist and teaching in the health professions and being in the medical school, I chose that one. And to be honest, it changed my life. I found my people. I learned a lot about education, but it was specific to medical and health professions education. And it was just all the things that through my psychology training, I wish I had, and I wish I had known. I was glad I got an opportunity to know that coming in. So, it was not just about, curriculum design and assessments and those sorts of things, but it was really very much focused on the uniqueness that is health professions education, which is as much around behavioural aspects as it is around knowledge and skills. So that started my journey. And because I did that degree, I was very quickly put into year 4 of our undergraduate medical training, which was psychiatry, because I was a psychologist, brand new course, first year of implementation and no exams. So that what I learned in that course was very helpful. But I really had to hit the ground running. So to be honest, and that sort of much has been my experience in medical education ever since. You just get put into a role and you immediately have to hit the ground running. Generally, there's a little bit of a crisis, but thank goodness I had the formal skills to do that. So that's the first part. Do you have any questions about that? Because I can keep going.
No, please continue.
Okay, so then at Monash, which is in Australia, I was then moved around to various parts of the medical curriculum. So it seemed to be that if there was an area that needed some work and sort of was getting a little bit behind, I was given the job to sort of work on that and bring it into the modern day. So it was always wonderfully challenging, but also working with people in a very enthusiastic way. So after the psychiatry experience, I then Worked in our on-campus years, so years 1 and 2 of our medical course, which we had campuses, and we have still campuses in Malaysia, all around Australia. And so it was a whole curriculum renewal, bringing it all back, had it all sort of disintegrated, bringing it all back together, working with our colleagues across Malaysia and also in the various areas in Australia. And then after that, I worked in assessment. So I was director of assessment for the whole of our medical courses. And I did that for a number of years, brought in some innovations. And then I ended my career in medical education at the undergrad level as in selection and admissions. So I did that for a number of years. And all of this is part of medical education. So we often think of medical education as just what the students learn, but selection right through to the education and right back out now into professional development education. It's just been a whole journey. So that's been my journey in Australia.
Okay, so now at this point, actually, if we could take a pause, because we'll get to the American part of your journey in a little bit. But you mentioned two things that I want to explore a little bit, and given how things are going so far, I'm not even sure we're going to be able to get to the questions that I had planned. So one thing that you had mentioned was when the curriculum was getting a little old, a little stale, it needed to be updated, right? So my thought is, how do you know, right? Because just medical knowledge is exploding, and we can't expect the students to know, be on the cutting edge of everything. So how do we know when it's time to update the curriculum or take something out of the curriculum or add something to the curriculum? Like, how do you, it sounds like it's a very broad question. I apologize, but
no, it's a very
where do you
good
even
question.
Start?
It's a very good question, and it's a very important question. And there's a couple of elements to it. So medical education has the benefit of having a huge literature. So it's very easy to keep up with what's going on around the world, and I always look to often the Canadians. They seem to be doing a lot of work in leading the way. And so, things like problem-based learning, now we're into, EPAs and all these things that come out. There's always an evidence base to help you make a decision whether that is something that we should, in our institute should be investing in, or waiting until there's more information and so on. So the literature that drives medical education is vast, and it's accessible. So that's one point. The other point is, and to me the most important is, I listen to the students, because they know what they want, and they know when things are out of date, because they're not just looking at their medical textbooks, and they're out there learning in a whole range of different ways, and so they're very good at alerting us to when things are sort of maybe not meeting their needs as learners. And we've certainly seen that through the COVID pandemic, and medical education has been very slow to use technology in the ways that students, have wanted to use it. And so a bunch of medical students at Harvard, in the Harvard Innovation Lab, actually developed a whole different way of using technology for teaching, which was very handy when COVID came along. So the students themselves are saying, this is old-fashioned way of learning. We want to learn in these ways, and if we don't do that, they'll do it themselves. So when we undertook any curriculum renewal, I spoke to a lot of people, colleagues around the world. I did a lot of work in the literature, then also did consulting internally to see whether this is something that we think we would get engagement in, including the students in that, and do we have the resources, of course, to do that. So it was a range of things, like we had a horizontal curriculum that had sort of, got out of whack. So we had to realign that. That's the easy part. But bringing in new ways of doing things is actually a little bit more challenging, but it's also very exciting. And it's a great way to get people engaged and excited in the medical education work. I have found that.
So what's an example of something that came out? What did you call it? The Harvard Innovation Lab? Yeah.
So, Vish Panwali, he's medical student. Well, he was a medical student. He's now an emergency doctor. Him and a bunch of friends developed, it was called Sophia.ai, which was basically a learning management platform where you could track the students could track themselves, lots of back-end learning analytics, all based on spaced education, and how we learn, the make it stick type approach. So all empirically based. And the idea there is that all of the ologies and all the knowledge that you need, you can get that online, right? And that means that you're then using time with patients, time whether they be simulated or real, time with the more senior consultants and practitioners who you want to learn from. You're really learning the skills that you can't get from YouTube, books, and any other way. So it makes that time more valuable for both the trainee and the educator. But it also is appealing to the way that the students these days want to learn. So they're more motivated to learn. But once COVID hit, that was they sort of reinvented it as so work, it's called. So it's basically a virtual environment where medical students, and now it's branching out to other courses, but medical students can learn together, but also socialize together. So they're learning, they've got all the materials, but they can order Uber Eats, they can, have champagne. So it's a virtual environment, but they're learning and socializing together. And they've just got millions of dollars of investment now to build that. So, this is something that came out of medical students themselves saying, we want to learn differently. And, if we'll build it ourselves. And it's been very, very popular. So to me, that's the sort of innovations that are coming. AR and VR, augmented reality and virtual reality are really opening up incredible opportunities for medical education and any education that involves actually, skills based, so that when you actually get to patients and consultants, that time, and, time is something that always comes up, is used in really meaningful ways. So I think that's where the revolution is coming. And mostly the current educators are not trained for that, actually.
And it sounds great for like procedures as well. Like if you're an anesthesiologist, right? And, I've never intubated someone before, but I've done it 400 times in the lab, right? So it is very different from, I've never done this before.
Correct.
And that's just the end of the statement. So,
yep.
Whether it's high fidelity or low fidelity, and I'm sure it's all going to be evolving. It's a very different animal if you've actually, practiced the skills and gotten positive and negative feedback and all. Yeah. There was something else that you mentioned earlier about candidate selection, and I hadn't even thought that would be something, we would be talking about today. But I hate to miss an opportunity to talk about something like this, because anytime I've read anything about candidate selection, it's more like exam scores don't predict good doctors, and this doesn't predict, and this doesn't. It's all negative. So, candidate selection, what does predict, and how do you even identify? How do you even define what a good doctor is? Is it like a skilled surgeon, or someone with a moral compass, or someone that remembers, every step of Krebs cycle? Right? How do we even start with good? And I'm sorry that this went in so many directions, but
no, that's good. And look, selection, again, there's a huge body of literature on this. Selection does not necessarily predict performance in exam. I mean, it does, but there's way more of the variance not understood than there is understood. But I don't think the purpose of selection is to predict performance. It's to predict candidates who will get through the training, right? So to me, the success of selection is the graduates who graduate successfully. And of course, for the most part, certainly in our country, 95 or 6% do. So in that sense, selection is very good. I think where selection it could be doing a lot more is in diversity. So, we're still, when I was leading assessment, and we had 4,000 to 5,000 applicants for 242 positions. So, you can just draw a line at the top. So these other, multiple mini interviews, situational judgment tests, those sorts of things, allow you to have more of a diverse view of the applicants, and therefore the students and the graduates that you want. So you're looking at more personal characteristics. But I still think we could do a lot more in selection, because at the moment in Australia, we have, in a lot of places, we have a chronic shortage of doctors willing to work in rural areas. So we are still selecting urban specialists, and we're actually screening out in the selection process the very people who are more likely to go and work in rural areas where there is a significant need. So, I think there's a lot of work to be done there, where we just say it's not, not all about just getting the high performers. It's actually about, because when I say, if I say it's not just about the high performers, well, I'm talking about not, the 99th percentile, maybe we can go down to the 97th percentile and actually still have people who are more willing and more likely to go,
without a significant drop in quality, right? What's the difference between the 99th and the 97th percentile, right? It's got to be minimal.
Absolutely. We have students from First Nations and significantly disadvantaged cohorts who come in on, the 80th percentile, and they do very well. Admissions the admission scores are based on the popularity of the course. They're not based on actually what you need to survive or get through that course. So medicine is well. So in Australia anyway, the scores that are required to get into a degree are based on the popularity of that degree. So the more people who want to do that degree, the higher the score, because you have more of a pool to choose from. It's not based on what you need to succeed. And so if we did that,
right, because then you'd catch a lot more. You'd have a lot more candidates than spots to fill if it was based on that. Okay, that makes sense. Okay.
So selection is the first and most important tests that doctors do, because that's what gets you into the training in the first place.
Yeah. The American system probably does that very well, right? Can you make it through the material? Because it is, you've got to take all of these undergrad courses and you've got to make sure your GPA is high enough. And you've got to make sure. So it's like tests. So if you're good at taking tests, you will be able to then go on to medical school where you have to take even more tests. But then you're.
But does that make you a good doctor? Is the question. Is that, the difference in our system is we have people coming straight from high school. Some of them are 16 years old. We have, they do a 5-year course. And we've always done that. It's the UK model, it's the Australian model. So our education is significantly shorter than yours. And we're still graduating doctors who are highly competent in what they do. And then they do the 3 junior doctor years and then they go into their specialty training. So it's still a long journey. We also have your model, postgraduate, a degree followed by then, a postgraduate degree in medicine, which is just 1 year shorter. But what we have now is almost exclusively those people have biomedical science backgrounds. So we're just extending their training for 3 years. It's not the diversity that you have in America by any means. The friends and colleagues that I have met, the diversity of backgrounds that they've come from into medicine is unbelievable. And we just don't have that. And I think that's a loss for us.
Well, I think it's a product of our system asking people to make the decision later rather than sooner. And I've never heard someone describe the American medical system as being diverse before. I think this is a first for me, but you're talking about diversity of education. So you have someone coming in from an engineering school, someone coming up from a business school, someone coming in with an art history degree. That's what you're talking about. Just to clarify, you're not talking about like diversity, equity, inclusion of their, race and ethnicity. We're not talking about that.
No. Just the diversity. Yeah. So I think we have a long way to go in both our countries in regard to that.
Yeah.
The diversity and inclusion, for sure. Yeah. So the selection part is often overlooked, but it's absolutely essential and a really important part of medical education because that's where it all begins.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's contrast our systems a little bit. So again, a very broad question, but what would you say are the strengths and weaknesses of each system as it compares to the other, of the Australian education system as opposed to the US health education system or medical?
Well, I think as we've just discussed, the diversity of backgrounds that you have coming in, I think is a significant strength. But I also think it's a strength for us to have the school leaver course, the school leaver program, because we are actually having a shorter period of time for training. And, around the world, people are calling for shorter times. The amount of time it takes to be a health profession, whether it's a psychologist, a physiotherapist, physical therapist, a medical doctor, a nurse these days, it's just increasing, and we can't afford that. And that's really come home, through COVID, where we've had mass resignations, particularly in nurses and particularly in intensive care nurses that take 8 years to train. You can't just all of a sudden say, oh, we're going to fix that, we'll just have more. So length of training, I think, is an advantage for us. We don't have a licensing exam. We don't have a USMLE, which I actually think is an advantage for us, because you don't have all that effort in just focusing on passing the licensing exam, where we have the universities focusing on a much more broader range of competencies. As I know that obviously that's what all the graduates have, but it just takes off that focus on, essentially the energy that goes into passing those licensing exams.
Yeah, teaching to be a doctor instead of teaching to the test. Exactly.
Yeah. And summative assessment is actually being questioned now, even in undergrad training. Just teaching for passing tests and recall that, as you talked about before we started, that idea of just learning and then you pass a test and then you forget, to these more, empirically based learning processes like spaced education, making it stick type approach, which is really around, reflection time and formative assessment and feedback, so that when you need that information, it's there, as opposed to, I know I did it for an exam, but I've forgotten. This is the forward movement, I think, of where medical education and all education is going, and technology really helps there. Really helps.
And you said spaced education. That's something that we've talked about on the show a long time ago with Chase DeMarco, who's, I'm not sure where he is in his training right now. He's another podcaster. He calls himself the medical mnemonist, like mnemonic. And what he said was, it's more likely to be sticky if you learn something on, say, Monday, and then again on Wednesday, and then maybe the following Friday. So like 10 days later. So you're getting it at irregular spaced intervals. I just want to clarify. That's what you're referring to, correct?
So it's spaced in that it's irregular interviews. So the interval. So the idea is that just as information is starting to be forgotten, it's reinforced. But the other important part of this, though, is that you keep. So, for example, in a quiz, you'll ask questions that you got right at least 3 more times, and then they're retired. But the questions that you haven't answered, they keep repeating until you actually get them right. So, Duolingo to learn a language, a lot of the apps now, learning apps, are based on these principles. So you're basically interrupting the forgetting curve. And by doing that, you're translating that into solid memory, into consolidated memory. And
that's
see
really
why technology is so helpful.
Because my current certification, in order to be board certified in otolaryngology, which is what I am in the United States, previously every 10 years we'd have to take a test in order to get recertified. Well, now they've thrown that out. And what I do is I do these quarterly assessments. And if I get a question wrong, they bring it up again. And so it sounds like they're teaching me without me realizing that that's what I'm doing. So they identify things that are important for us to know, and they're asking us if we know it, great. And if we don't know it, they bring it up again and again and again and again. So,
and it's an interesting philosophical difference, because, a lot of our education and feedback focuses on what we did well. And we got those, we got 85% on the exam. We don't really care about the part that we didn't get. This is all focusing on what you don't know. That's where the focus is.
Which seems like that's the point of a test to begin with. If my 6-year-old takes a math test and he gets a question wrong, that's what I need to know. I need to know what he got wrong so we can go over it again, instead of just like celebrating the questions right. Yeah.
Correct. So it's really focusing on making sure that we have that comprehensive knowledge, because, it might be different now, but when you do an exam and you know what you get wrong, half the time you don't even have access to which parts you didn't get wrong, or which part, you know which ones you got right. It's very hard to actually improve on that knowledge. So this is a great way of doing that.
Yeah, I love it. Okay. So speaking of getting questions wrong, so something that happened all throughout my training and is currently happening through lots of people's training is you'll be on ward rounds. And this is just an example. I don't want to go into, the ins and outs of ward rounds just yet. But maybe by the Socratic method, you're pimping them. It used to be still called. And when you get a question wrong, you end up feeling like garbage. Like that happens so many times. It happened so many times during my training, and it happens so many times to other people now. So now that I'm in the tables are turned, and I sometimes have students with me, how do I make sure I'm teaching a student, like when they get something wrong, how do I teach them without making them feel like garbage about it?
So, Brad, I mean, you can reflect on your own experiences with that way of learning. It's not motivating. And in fact, often it puts you in a sense of stress. So you actually don't learn anything from that moment on. So there's a lot of work being done now, and it's going to be demanded in health professions education and also in healthcare practice. This whole notion of psychological safety, where you actually create an environment where it is okay to ask questions and respond to questions and actually get them wrong. Now, it might not be by the bedside where that's the best to happen, but, that idea of, in front of a patient and firing questions, I mean, really, to me, that's a very old-fashioned way of learning. This, have do this sort of question and answer either before you're in front of the patient, where you can go back and forth and then in the moment with the patient, there's actually questions that didn't come up because you're in the real situation now, but you're better equipped to answer and respond to them. So, I'm sure you're familiar with the term psychological safety, Amy Edmondson's work. We talk about this all the time now, particularly because the current generation expect it. They expect more from their leaders. They don't respond to hierarchy anymore. They're just different people. And they have much higher expectations of their leaders and how their leaders treat them. And so this idea that they can't be part of their own learning journey and be able to communicate and put things out there for discussion, and maybe they're wrong without being cut down, is very old-fashioned. And if someone says something, that isn't quite right, then, your response can be, well, that's not right. Or your response can be to explore that response, because it can't be entirely wrong. And even to question why that was the response. What was the rationale for that response? And then in that discussion, you can bring them to actually a different rationale for what would be the correct response.
Okay.
Does that make sense? Did I answer your question?
Yeah, it does. You're putting a lot more effort into, instead of it just being the right or the wrong answer, kind of exploring the thought process behind. Let's take a step back. How did you arrive at that answer? Okay, well, this part of it was correct, but this part of it, let's try and steer you in a different direction. So it sounds more like you've identified that they didn't quite get there, and then you're helping them to get there instead of just squashing them, which was what we did before.
But isn't that how you practice medicine though as well? It's there are times when it's black and white, but there are times when it isn't, right? Yeah. And so we're also teaching them thought processes that, I went down that path, but actually, I should have thought of this. So that's that's more learning. And it's very important learning.
And you said that the students expect it now. And, in some ways, people might think of that as a very entitled way to be. We expect you to teach us this way. But I think what it really is no, if you are in medical education and you're responsible for training the next generation of doctors, you're either invested enough to use the latest innovations in learning in order to help them the most to become the best doctors they can be, or you're just not invested enough to know that stuff. And so they are entitled to someone who is invested enough to know what works and what doesn't.
Absolutely. And I think it's very entitled of us to say, I learned like this, and therefore you learn like this, because that's why medical education does not innovate very quickly. It innovates very slowly and has been. And COVID moved us forward, but I can already see us going back to where we were. So, the fact that we innovated so quickly and so collegially during COVID, hierarchies went out the window because we had to, shows that we can do it. We absolutely can do it. But I can see us now, going back to the traditional way. So I would say that it's the students who are entitled to get the education they need to learn how to be a practitioner in this world. And that's probably not where their current their current consultants and senior people have come from. And particularly, I'll go a little bit off track here, but this is a really important point. I was reading a report by Microsoft around, they interviewed a whole bunch of hospital CEOs, and they were from various countries around the world. And all of those CEOs had their major agenda was technology, to increase technology in the hospital. But yet only 30% of them had any investment in training the people to use those technologies, including the health practitioners. So right there is a crisis. You're bringing in technology and you're not training the people who have to use it or teach others to use it how to use it. They're not even thinking about that. So that just now, I know personally, so doctors who are in their later years who are ending their practices now because they can't keep up with the technology. But they are major losses to the profession. So, we can't ignore technology. We have to start embracing it and learning how to use it and understand it, because that's what our learners, they're ahead of us now. This was a former dean saying to me, the registrars are coming in and getting frustrated with him because he doesn't know the passwords of, four different systems that he now has to work with. And, because in his day, he sat down with a bunch of paper and just worked through the case, the patient, and put it all together. Now he's got to navigate 4 different systems. So, it's a different world, and we need to prepare our students for that world.
My medical school was trying to push the envelope by getting us all to buy Palm Pilots at the beginning of medical school. So we all bought Palm Pilots and used them. And where's the technology now? Yeah.
Where's
the Palm Pilot is in a garbage somewhere far away.
So, but this is how quickly, I had a Palm Pilot too. I was one of the first people in Australia to have one. And, they literally, the iPhone killed them. So, but, that's how quickly technology changes. So you can't keep up with the technology itself, but you can keep up with how it works and learn skills generalized to other products when they come. But we can't ignore it.
So let's say you had a room full of seasoned attendings, and I'm not sure what's the Australian term for attending? Is it registrar? Registrar. So you had a room full of seasoned attendings, right? Like not in the not ready to retire, like the who you just mentioned, but maybe in the middle of their career. What would you want them to know to help them be better teachers? Like whether they're giving a lecture or they are leading ward rounds, or they've got a student with them during office hours, really in any of those, what's like some overarching pearl that you would want them to know to help them be the best teacher they can be?
Well, first of all, I would encourage them to reflect on their own training and what was good and worked for them and really enabled their learning, and what did not. Because, learning to be a doctor shouldn't be the test of survival that it is, right? So just to reflect on their own experiences, because often we just, even, unconsciously, most of our decisions, in fact, all of our decisions are based on things we already know, okay? So it's very hard to break that cycle. So if we reflect back on what worked for us, what we found very productive and what we struggled with in a really honest way, and say, okay, I don't want my students to experience that, and then work out ways that can be changed for their students. I'd also encourage them to take time. I mean, I truly believe that the current situation in the hospital systems, certainly in developed countries like Australia and America, if we were to just reduce the capacity to 80%, that would free up so much of everybody's time to do a better job at whatever their job is, right? So when you're running at 98%, and everybody is stretched, and then you get a global pandemic on top of that, and we already have burnout and stress, and in our case, unfortunately, suicide rates in young doctors. This is terrible, right? So just by reducing to 80% capacity, we would open up time for doing these really important things that don't seem to be a priority right now. And it really is that easy to fix it. So it's the system part, and then the attitude toward their student part. We're very, very strong on patient safety, but we haven't been strong enough on student and healthcare worker safety. And we've just let the ball drop on that. And we can't do that anymore. So I would encourage everyone to look at their students as future colleagues, as people that matter, as people that are doing their best, to be the best healthcare worker that they can be. And as opposed to, someone who's annoying, I haven't got time, and I'm supposed to be doing this, and, and yes, what do you want? All of those subtle and unsubtle cues that say, you actually don't matter. So just make them matter, because the learning will happen. We always say you can put medical students anywhere and they will learn. But what we bring is the opportunity to share experiences and to make them feel valued and to be actually looking forward to their career, as opposed to, being stressed and burnt out and feeling inadequate and all of those things. So it's an attitude set that I think needs to change. Probably not the answer you're expecting, but.
No, but it ties back into the psychological safety that you were talking about. Like if you're not in a psychologically safe situation, you're not going to learn, right? You're not going to remember. You're going to be, your cortisol is going to be up, your dander is going to be up, and you're just going to stop learning. But if you're in a psychologically safe space, and that's what it sounds like you're saying here, like make sure that the space that your student, that your learner is in, is a psychologically safe space, and they will learn. They will learn. So the priority here is making sure that they feel valued, appreciated, and safe, and they will learn.
They will learn. Now, just to clarify, psychological safety isn't, everyone sitting around hugging each other and, only ever being nice. That's not what it is. It's about having that can be very difficult discussions, but in a respectful way. So, you can give feedback that's needed, but the idea is you do it in a respectful way, that you listen and you're open, and, and that therefore it's actually heard. So it's not this idea that everyone just loves each other. It's actually just really around being respectful and, so the person can learn, and we all can learn from experiences where we need to.
Yes, that is not the direction I was expecting you to take it with, but nonetheless, I mean, it's for a question that was that broad. I think you came out with some brass tacks advice that we can really all bring to the table tomorrow to make it a better situation for everybody.
Look, Brad, I always say kindness is free, but the impact that kindness has on others is enormous. So it's something that you can do tomorrow, and just change someone's experience of an event in a positive way, and then they go and do that. Because that's not what we're modelling right now. We're modelling unkindness. Yeah. The kindness is there in pockets, but overall,
it's an exception rather than a rule.
Exactly, and it should be the rule. And then the exception becomes, such a shock and not appropriate. Yeah. So, to me, this is that small change will make enormous impact in so many other ways.
Well, thank you for the kindness of coming on the podcast and talking to us about medical education. So where can people find you online?
I'm online. I'm on LinkedIn. Margaret Hay on LinkedIn is probably. I am on Twitter, but I confess I go in and out of Twitter depending on how I feel. At Margaret Hay, but mostly LinkedIn is where I am in social media. I have lots of friends in America. We never got to talk about the Harvard Macy Institute, but I'm sure others will talk about that. But that has been a life-changing event for me, just to have a whole network of people around the world. And that's how I know you. You know Eric Gantwerker, who's my friend, and we met through Harvard Macy. So getting involved in a network like that is really important for educators. So I would encourage.
Eric's going to be coming back on the show to talk more about education. And so I will make sure that we focus a lot on that during that interview. That interview is coming up in a couple of weeks. So Dr. Margaret Hay, thank you so much for your time. This has been a fantastic interview.
Well, thank you, Bradley. I really appreciate it. And it's lovely to meet you as well. And great work on the podcast.
Thank you.
That was Dr. Bradley Block at the Physician's Guide to Doctoring. He can be found at physiciansguidetodoctoring.com or wherever you get your podcasts. If you have a question for a previous guest or have an idea for a future episode, send a comment on the webpage. Also, please be sure to leave a 5-star review on your preferred podcast platform. We'll see you next time on the Physician's Guide to Doctoring.